Hello and welcome to the Festival of Ideas. My name is Mary Garrison from the University of York, and I'll be chairing the event today. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Michelle Brown, FSA. She is Professor Emerita of Medieval Manuscript Studies at the School of Advanced Study in the University of London and is a visiting professor at University College London. She's a director of the Hereford Mappa Mundi Trust, patron of the Designer Bookbinders, and an honorary lay canon of Truro Cathedral. She was formerly curator of illuminated manuscripts at the British Library and a lay canon and chapter member of St. Paul's Cathedral, London. She's published, lectured, and broadcast widely on medieval cultural history. Her latest book, which she will be speaking about today, is Bede and the Theory of Everything, which I commend to you as a work of incredible insight, lucidity, vivid particular detail, but also a broad perspective and context of Bede and his world and how Bede made sense of his world.
You sure you read my book?
Just marvelous, yeah. Michelle, over to you.
Thank you, Mary. It's brilliant to be here. I live at Land's End at the minute because of a respiratory problem. You can hear I'm a bit gruff at the moment, but I'm trying to move north. So hopefully I'll be doing more up here soon. Right, anybody remember 1066 and all that? Oh, we're showing our age, aren't we? Horrible histories, anybody? Okay, the venomous Bede, yeah? Venerable, well, that was a title that was bestowed upon Bede in 1899 by the Pope, and he is the only venerable, i.e. a doctor of the church, to have been officially fielded by these islands. There are many other candidates, I'm sure, that we would also like to be put forward. But as early as the 730s, 40s, Boniface, the apostle to the Germans, was calling him the candle of the church. And that status is something that was upheld in 2 early 9th century Carolingian councils. So his reputation was already spreading quite early, and demands for his work was very, very high. What I want to do in this talk is actually get beyond the title and the venerability to actually try and find a little bit more of the real Bede. What am I supposed to be pointing at? Come on. It's not changing. Keyboard. Right, I will stay here. So a quote from the man himself. "My chief delight has always been in study, teaching, and writing." Now try asking any university lecturer that after first term and see if they still say the same. Well, this is Bede after many, many years. An Anglo-Saxon born in northeastern England in probably 673. We've just had the 1350th anniversary, and died there in 735, having lived as a priest and monk of the Northumbrian twin monastery of Wearmouth Jarrow. And the words that I've just read occur in his autobiographical note that concluded probably his most famous work, the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, Historia Ecclesiastica, which was completed in 731 according to the unified dating system from the birth of Christ, which he established in popular use in the West. Wasn't the first to do so. Dionysius Exiguus, an Eastern cleric, had had an experiment with it earlier. Exiguus meaning the little. Now, whether he was vertically challenged or excessively humble, we don't know. But Bede knew a good thing when he saw it and picked it up and ran with it. Before that, there were many, many different indictions and different calendrical systems, obviously in use. The problems of reconciling the lunar and the solar calendars had taxed many historians. And Bede set himself up as a bit of a one-man computer in order to do the hard number crunching to actually refine the system and to bring a lot of other material into a single dating point. It would have been possible at this period to have left York in 700 and to have got to Hexham in 695. Some might say you can still do that today, but there you go. So that's one of the achievements, and the idea that we can actually we're sitting in England is something that is often pinned on Bede. okay, and the fact that he's thought to have been from an Anglian background, hence England rather than Saxony or Jutland, for example. Now, let's start off with what do we know about his family background and the society that he came from. Don't worry, I'm not just going to read out endless slides. Now, he tells us that at the age of 7, he was given by his kinsman to a new social experiment, a monastery of a new sort that had been founded by Benedict Biscop, Monk Wearmouth, in 643. 643? What am I talking about? Sorry, I've ignored the 743. 674. Okay, and it was joined in 682 by its twin foundation, Jarrow, and Bede died there in 735 at the age of 62. You can tell I altered that paragraph at 4 a.m. this morning. Never alter something that you've written before at 4 a.m. is the message to take away from that. Anyway, so if you think about Benedict Biscop's project, it's a bit like the Zaha Hadid project of its day. These were new style buildings referencing the style of building in dressed masonry Morae Romanum, the work of giants that still littered the landscape, but which hadn't been engaged in for a couple of centuries or more. And it was something that carried immediate cultural reference and association, but also historic as well. And to be handed over to be part of that was probably a really exciting thing. Now, we might think that anybody to be alienated from their family at the age of 7, and there are an awful lot of them sadly on the planet at the moment, is a really scary and psychologically troubling thing. There are many Oxford and Cambridge dons who have gone perhaps through a similar system, having gone to boarding school at a very early age, progressed through university careers, and are still living in service departments in their colleges. Whether that gives you a normal, well-rounded experience or not, I leave it up to you and they to decide. But you know, it's not unparalleled even in our own age. It doesn't say that his parents alienated him, and bear in mind that from the Celtic hinterland, the idea of fostering, of actually having somebody else bringing up your children and you bringing up theirs as a way of cementing alignments and giving you a bigger family is something that wasn't considered strange at that time. So yeah, let's get that in a bit of perspective. Also, did Bede go into a monastery at 7? He needn't necessarily have stayed there. People would have gone in, got an education, and come out to fulfil other vocations as secular nobles, as bailiffs, reeves, etc., etc. Okay, so it wasn't a done deal necessarily. But Bede, even by the age of 7, he would have hung around the farmyard a fair bit. He'd have seen a lot of life. And in the communal hall, you can bet he heard a lot of other animal gruntings in the night as well. He'd have seen birth, he'd have seen death. So let's get away from the idea that he doesn't know anything about the world, even at that tender age. Now, the name Biscop, or Badger King, as Benedict was known, and Bede both appear in the list of the kings of Lindsey around 800. And it's been suggested that Bede may have come from a noble family and that he was perhaps even from the same line as Benedict Badger King. The name Bede in Old English, Bede, stems from beoden, to bid, to command, so if you like, the servant. Okay. It also occurs in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for 501 as one of the sons of the founder of Portsmouth, a Saxon. Now, the use of king-worthy names often indicates that you're part of a broader king-worthy lineage. The Liber Vitae of Durham, composed around the 840s for the Lindisfarne community, mentions 2 Bedes, one of whom was Cuthbert's personal chaplain, and the other one is probably our Bede. So again, he might have been named for that association with Cuthbert, who knows. And I think Kevin mentioned in the previous lecture that one of the suggestions that there's a lot of good place name evidence for Lindisfarne is the Lindisfarnensis Farensis, which is the people who travelled from Lindsey. And of course, there's an interesting history of survival, perhaps even politically, of a British enclave within Lindsey for a while in the post-Roman period. So you've got interesting connections between those areas. Now, if we look at his writings, we can see that Bede's educational background was that of the monastic schoolroom, as it had been remodelled in late 7th century England by Archbishop Theodore of Tarsus, one of the most educated men of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Eastern Church, who became Archbishop of Canterbury in 669 and brought with him Abbot Hadrian, who was possibly a North African Berber, and latterly an abbot in the vicinity of Naples. And there they founded an incredible school at Canterbury at the Cathedral and at Augustine's Abbey. And Benedict Biscop was the one who was charged with escorting them from Rome to Britain. And he stayed on for a couple of years to actually teach in their school. So you've got a direct route into that rich Mediterranean tradition. But of course, he hasn't just got that. He's got connections with an incredibly deep Irish learning as well in Northumbria. And it's a crossover of traditions there that makes Northumbria so incredibly rich culturally in many ways. Now, Bede tells us that at Canterbury they taught Latin, Greek, theology, exegesis, computistics, astronomy, medicine, poetry, and Gregorian chant. And that was just the morning. Aldhelm, of course, adds that he studied Roman law there as well. And we can see Bede taking a great interest in law. Now, the instruction methods were by Q&A sessions, but also by testing and proof. And they were interesting additions to the classical schoolroom scenario of learning by rote and memory training exercises. Okay, so he's got a good start. Couple that with the fact that Benedict Biscop and Chalfrith established the best library resource of the post-Roman Western world at Monk Wearmouth, Jarrow, and you've got somebody who's got the training, who's got the resources, who's got something of an international network through possibly his family background, but mostly through the church, and somebody who, above all, has got the most incredible intellectual curiosity. And Monk Wearmouth there, Jarrow on the other side, you can see remains of the 7th century fabric that you can still visit there, with the lower stages and the nave of Monk Wearmouth and the easternmost of the twin Gemini churches at Jarrow. And I think the dating is quite interesting. 674 for Monk Wearmouth and 681 to 2 for Jarrow. And I suggested elsewhere that this is a great symbolic gesture. The idea of having a twin monastery, which Bede describes as two places with but one will, is unusual, possibly even unique. Okay. Now, in 681 was the Great Sixth Ecumenical Council in Constantinople, for which the G8 pre-summit was organised by Theodore in Hatfield to the north of London in 679. And this was partly to debate the nature of the human and divine wills. How could Christ have been human and divine at the same time? And you had all sorts of heresies, adoptionism, was he the adopted son of God, to explain this. And of course, the schisms that had produced in the East, they were trying to prevent extending into the West. And the synod in 681, there would have been Eastern clerics present at Hatfield and probably Western clerics present in Constantinople, was that ultimately the two wills were indivisible and that the human will could never disobey the divine will. And the moments of that signification were accepting birth as a human to know what we go through and what we can put each other through, and the moment of crucifixion and redemptive sacrifice. And from that point onwards, the iconographies of the Nativity, the Incarnation, and the crucifixion become increasingly popular in the East and also in the West, and very much within Northumbria. And Bede's exegesis plays an important role in that. Bede tells us that Biscop brought with him masons and glaziers from Gaul, because those skills had died out in the post-Roman period. By the time they built Jarrow, it suggested that Anglo-Saxon craftsmen had been trained up as well. But I think there's a level of symbolism which you always have to look for in Bede, because, of course, when the temple was built, the list of craftspeople who worked on the temple included Gentiles, and it was important that it was a collaborative gesture. And Bede, of course, is very much, I think, writing the Historia Ecclesiastica as the Star Wars sequel to Eusebius's great 4th century history of the Christian church and people. So it's where the English sit as within that ongoing tradition. So you get a lot of these things, a lot of biblical references that we have to determine whether they're literal or not, or whether a literal event is being given a symbolic, deep time twist and a background. Okay? This is Rosemary Cramp, the late great Rosemary Cramp's model of Jarrow, where Bede died. And you can see that you've got the two churches at that, the Gemini, the little one to the eastern end for the community itself, still survives as the nave of the current church. And then in the foreground, you've got the communal refectory and dormitory, and then the abbot's house, we think, at the eastern end, and a little room with a chaplain next to it, which it suggested is, from references in Bede's work and the letters surrounding his death, is where Bede may have taught and where he spent his final days. Okay, and both sides, of course, are on riverine communication systems. They're near Roman forts, and they're still very much tapped in to that communication system, both within these islands and internationally. So that have been coming and going. Can you just imagine Bede as a young boy in there, under 12, and he's rushing around, he's getting under everybody's feet, he's trying to dip his finger in the molten glass, is that hot? He's mixing mortar, and he develops an incredible interest in the physics and the nature of the natural world, which is why several of his works deal with the nature of things, following on from the encyclopedic works of Pliny the Elder and Isidore of Seville, and also the nature of time and on the calculation of time. So the nature of space, the nature of time, think of it as a Celtic cross, if you like. The verticality of space, the horizontality of space, the verticality of time, and the ring-headed cross, the quantum of physics and eternity. Yeah? So Bede's mind structure, I think the reason I was drawn to write about him is it's the long thinking, it's the joined-up thinking and the long view that I just wish we had more of in society. And I guess part of writing the book for popular audience is to draw attention to some of those things. He had his blind spots as well. For Bede, the pursuit is for eternal harmony and the quest for that within human history and within the natural world. And so anything that he saw as disrupting that harmony, such as the obduracy of the post-Roman church and its continuum sticking to its traditions even after the Columban church and Iona had come around to international practices in 715, meant that they were a disruptive factor. And that's partly, as well as the fact that there are antagonistic relationships between the Anglo-Saxons and the genocide that people like Edgefrith are perpetuating against British communities. There are tensions there, but it's the disruption of the eternal harmony that I think leads Bede to be as anti-British as he is. We all have our blind spots, don't we just? It doesn't mean they're right. He's got a great empathy with children and with women. There's one touching little episode where he relates a little boy, Essica, who was placed in the care of the Barking nuns, or rather the nuns of Barking Abbey in Essex. and Elfled, the daughter of King Oswy of Northumbria, and they were both placed in religious foundations before they were a year old. And the little boy, Essica, is particularly affecting. And why does Bede go into this detail? The little boy becomes ill. Bear in mind that this is a period when you've got, it's thought, the worst rates of plague and pestilence and famine and cattle murrain than any other point in history other than the Black Death and many parts of the world now. Okay, and so this is a dangerous time to be around. And the little boy succumbs, and on his deathbed, he cries out for the nun that he's got a particular relationship with, his surrogate mother figure, Edgith, Edgith, Edgith. And at the moment that he dies, Edgith hears him call and promptly dies herself to be able to take care of him on the journey. And that's a very personal insight, I think, for Bede, this identification with a child in a new community looking for points of personal relationship and reference. These are very personal items. These are bone prickers, and there's a stylus from the vicinity of the room in the abbot's house in Jarrow, where it may have been that Bede taught, and this little wooden portable altar, which is of the period as well. So there are some elements of literacy generation around that room that, again, were personal insight. And you're looking down now into the 7th century church. Ignore the fenestration. The masonry is 7th century. Where at one point, when Bede was about 13, he and Abbot Ceolfrith, I think it has to be Bede, he writes in the Lives of the Abbots that everybody else was either sick or dead, and only Ceolfrith and a young boy were able to keep the divine office, the 8 hours of prayer and psalmody, of song and prayer, throughout the whole day and night. Bede must, I'm sure, have been that boy. And they'd have had to have been responsible, with however many lay people were still surviving, for nursing not only the brethren, but the wider community. So it was a big thing for him to have gone through, and must have been personally a very traumatic thing, as well as a faith-affirming thing for them to have kept their worship alive. And at their heyday in the early 8th century, it's estimated by Rosemary and others that there may have been as many as 600 monks in Wearmouth Jarrow. So even at this early stage, for only 2 of them to be left at Jarrow shows a high rate of sickness and mortality. And I think when you look at his commentary on the first book of Samuel, I'm just trying to work out how long I can speak for. Mary, when are you going to pull me off the stage? 15:15?
You still have until 10 past.
15:15, come on. His commentary on 1 Samuel shows that Bede had a very personal affinity with the prophet priest Samuel, who anointed Saul and David and established the sacral priestly role of kingship, mediated and regulated by the priesthood. So, if you like, Bede sees himself in succession to a kingmaker. And of course, it's certainly Bede who largely determines which ones of them were to be remembered and how in the pages of his history. So if he's Samuel, who is Eli, to whom he was entrusted by his mother? Well, it's Abbot Ceolfrith, who he always presents in a very sort of personal relationship. And of course, Samuel had been born to a mother who was desperate to try and conceive, had been unsuccessful, and she promised him to the Lord in the womb. And he was given at birth virtually to the high priest Eli. And Bede makes references that indicate again that it may be that the reason he was given over at such an early stage is because he was deemed to have been conceived and spoken for in the womb even. And it's particularly poignant when you read his account of Ceolfrith's decision in old age to travel to Rome to retire in 716 to spend his last days amongst the tomb of the apostles. And this caused Bede such severe sorrow. You can almost, if we had an autographed copy, you'd see the tears stains on the page, and we could probably do some interesting DNA sampling. But we haven't got a first generation. We've got some that were written within a decade of his death. And it's a great trauma to him. And his work was actually disrupted. There's a period of about 6 months to a year when he doesn't seem to have kept up the usual rate of productivity. And think how productive he was. Scholars agree that he wrote 40 works. Some of them would suggest as many as 60 books. And they're all substantive, yeah? So he is definitely very prolific, as well as teaching, and the 8 hours of bobbing up and down for the divine office. And he wasn't only a monk. You didn't have to be a priest, but he wanted to be a priest. He was fast-tracked to deacon at the age of 19, and he became a priest at the age of 30, the age at which Christ was thought to have begun his public ministry, okay? But he doesn't seem to have been ambitious within that. But as we'll see, unless I'm dragged off too soon, he becomes very radical in the last stages. And one of the last things he does is to write to the Archbishop of York and basically point out the problems if you pull the rug out from underneath pastoral and sacramental ministry in rural communities. Things very, very much of contemporary relevance within the church. And he's not above actually putting his head above the parapet. And I think Bede would always have compromised any suggestion of any promotion and administrative responsibilities, partly because he could be a bit of a stirrer, and partly because he wanted to stay close to the source of what had inspired him with his faith and his scholarship and his very joined-up research programme, which he saw as his form of mission ministry, and the song that he'd been given to sing, his unique song. And we know, of course, from others that Bede loved songs. He loved pop songs. He wrote not only a prose life of Cuthbert, he wrote a verse one that you could sing perhaps if you wanted to. And he liked verse in his own language, Old English. And some of the earliest examples of Anglo-Saxon poetry come from him, his death song, and Caedmon's hymn, etc. The cowherd who's gifted with the gift of song when he's hiding out with the cattle at Whitby, so he doesn't have to do his turn at singing round the table after dinner. I'm sure a few of us have hidden the equivalent of a cowboy when that's happened. He also, we think, only travelled about 65 miles from the monasteries in his lifetime. We know he went to Lindisfarne, possibly twice. We know he went to York. However, in his mind, he went right the way around the Near East. And his De Locis Sanctis on the holy places, which is partly modelled on Adovnan and Alculf, a bishop from Gaul who gets blown off course and spends Christmas on Iona dictating his pilgrim accounts and drawing plans of the holy places on wax tablets. Real or literary topos is argued, but Bede put it all together, and along with his biblical research and his encyclopedic work amongst the remains of classical works and early Christian works that Biscop and Chalfrith had managed to assemble, and his imagination, he produced a work which was still being used as a basic traveller's guide in the early 20th century. A journey of the spirit and the imagination that he and others took. And in my work in the last decade at St. Catherine's Sinai, at the foot of the mountain where Moses received the tablets of the law, I've found 5-level palimpsests because skins are at a premium in the middle of the desert, erased, overwritten. And 2 of the hands in one of those palimpsests are 9th century Northumbrians from the mid-8th century Northumbrians. So he may even have inspired some of his counterparts or those in the next generation to undertake those journeys to the holy places. Aidan on Lindisfarne. He's very pro-Lindisfarne, is Bede, although he's got problems with them until they conform in 715. Now, Bede also can be said to have made a major contribution to the study of science in the extent that science was known at this early period. The nature of things, on time, the calculation of time. He knew the configuration of the solar system, even if, like everybody until Copernicus, he thought it all revolved around us. And his work on lunar observations, in his work of producing a reliable tables for calculating the movable feast of Easter led him to observe the waxing and waning of the moon, which he related to tides. Therefore, essentially, although he didn't call it such, working out the gravitational pull of the moon and going on to apply that practically to produce the first tide timetables, which were so necessary for those scudding up and down the Northumbrian coast. And I'm sure we've all walked the waymarkers, etc., on Lindisfarne and looked at the SUVs stranded on the causeway for not looking at the tide timetables as they come in. This is a 12th century copy of his tract on the nature of time. In the 12th century, the scholastics liked to add diagrams to elucidate these earlier syllabus texts better. And this is a rapid reckoner decimal system using the fingers that was developed by Bede, but has a dual purpose also for monastic sign language at times when you're not supposed to speak, but you want them to pass the salt in the refectory. Now, I called my book Bede and the Theory of Everything. That's partly to try and catch people's attention, I'll be honest, but it is part of what I'm saying about the joined-up thinking and my work on his research programme and what he was working on when. We tend to look at him either as a historian, the father of English history, a patristic exegete, somebody who worked in poetry. We categorise it in the way in which we tend to. We talk about interdisciplinarity, but we like to put things in little subject categories. For Bede, it's far more joined up. And so I thought about the attempts in the 20th century to try and produce a theory of everything, a TOE, which is designed to explain physical phenomena in the universe. And it's a bit of a holy grail for some. And of course, the development of quantum mechanics and relativity and the fact that they don't work if you apply them to each other has been part of the problem with this. And I think it's interesting to remind ourselves in a neo-secularist society of what Einstein once said to a student: I want to know how God created the world. I'm not interested in this or that phenomenon, in the spectrum of this or that element. I want to know his thoughts. The rest is just details. We tend to have now put religion and science, faith and science, on two separate idolatrous pillars, and they're very much two-dimensional Aunt Sally representations, and the degree of debate between the apologists on either side, I think, has been particularly poor. For Bede, what I find interesting is that his mindset could be open enough to not feel that the works of the classics and the experimental science that he engaged in were a threat to his faith, and that his ability to determine the workings out of human history while still perceiving a larger, more visionary context that extended beyond our concepts of time into an eternity and was infinite, reminded me rather of what Bede and Hawking said, Einstein and Hawking said, that inability to get your head around that side of things was partly why they couldn't achieve a TOE, but they would have liked to. For Bede, through a glass darkly and in the very early stages of development, I think he could. I find that interesting. Anyway. And if we would think about a visualization of that matrix, and we think about something like the visualizations from the CERN Hadron Collider, when you look at the great incipit pages and the carpet pages in the Lindisfarne Gospels, I think this is pretty much as close as you can get to Bede's visualization of that model of the quantum of eternity and the dynamic of matter. Matter matters, but the spiritual dimension of something that's bigger and more quantum as well. Yeah, and I think Bede had a hand in the Lindisfarne Gospels. Eadfrith, the Bishop of Lindisfarne, who I think made the Gospels as a single person penitential exercise between 715 and 22 on Cadizal, the little tidal island off of the main island of Lindisfarne, over a period of 10 years or so. knew Bede. Bede dedicated his prose life of Cuthbert to him. He had dealings with him later in life as well, when King Ceolwulf, for example, was in exile on the island. The island had, I think, relations with Bede at that point. And we know that Weymouth Jarrow sent to Eadfrith a good copy of the Vulgate version of the Gospels that they'd edited from a Neapolitan exemplar that Eadfrith was able to use, but also other things. Eadfrith, working on his rock, is able to use experimental chemistry to develop something that Photoshop tells us is 90 separate pigments. When we did a non-destructive Raman laser analysis in 2003, we found there were 6 locally available rocks and plants, but they've been very cleverly manipulated to actually produce this extended palette that challenged that of Byzantium and the Silk Route. And when you're living in that sort of environment and you're a Bear Grylls survivalist and every substance around you, you've got to know how to use. It's quite remarkable. And so 40 Shades of Purple, made from the orchil, the grey-green lichen that grows at your feet on Cuddy's Rock. Why 40? Is it just aesthetic preference? Well, no, because Bede, his friend, has just finished writing De Tabernaclo and De Templo, in which he speaks about the 40 shades of the hangings of the temple curtains, and each shade represents a separate stage in the journey of the soul. He can't get lapis lazuli from Badakhshan in the foothills of the Himalayas, but he knows about it, so he fakes it by boiling up the woad plant. But not content with just having the colour, he puts hoof and horn animal gum crystals into it to give the surface appearance of ground lapis, which was still fooling scientists as late as 2000. Because you don't just need lapis, you need to have the recipe and you need to ground the particles to just the right size so that you get that intensity of blue rather than stone-washed denim. Okay? So those sort of things, I think, he's relating to Bede and his view of the natural world. And of course, for Bede also, Neoplatonic ideas of harmony, the fourfold harmony is the ultimate goal. Of harmony in creation, that beauty reflects that harmony and that equals the good. And so I think the aesthetic driver behind the aesthetics of Lindisfarne Gospels and the relationship of the natural world within that, in an aniconic depiction of the enormity rather than God as an old man with a grey beard, speaks of the cosmic logos. It's pretty profound stuff. Nearly finished, Mary, don't worry. Nearly there. And of course, all worked out using Euclidean and Pythagorean geometry, the golden section, and rabbinic numerology, number symbolism, with the flora and fauna and the movements of the elements, etc., within it. Lots of other things we can talk about, the symbolism there. And bear in mind, it's only a generation or two ago that Bede was living in, and his parents were living in the Wild West, literally. It's a big, big social transformation and accommodation, which the Anglo-Saxons and the post-Roman peoples, with their continued legacy, made pretty effectively, even despite all the tensions. Just to the last days. I think it's interesting that Bede ends the Historia Ecclesiastica at 731. Why didn't he carry on writing that? Well, A, his research programme was different, but B, that's the year that the king who he rather favours amongst the contenders in Northumbria at that time, Ceolwulf, was deposed and went in Clericatu to live in the monastery of Lindisfarne. He did make a comeback. I think it was probably too dangerous for Bede to carry on writing, especially as he seems to have rather party prees views about Lindisfarne and Ceolwulf, because they were kind of espousing more of a mixed economy, whereas the Walfridian model, perpetuated by Acca at Hexham, was one of a sort of militaristic, hierarchical organisation of dioceses with parishes, etc., and rather given to currying power and wealth in high places, keeping fine table, etc. Bede is very pro the more Celtic model of Columba and Cuthbert, and will speak about the ascetic tradition. So this is him on Lindisfarne when the Irish monks withdraw after the Synod of Whitby. The place which they governed showed how frugal and temperate St Aidan and his predecessors were. There were very few houses beside the church. Indeed, no more than were barely sufficient to make civilised life possible. They'd also no money, but only cattle. If they received any money from rich persons, they immediately gave it to the poor, there being no need to gather money or provide houses for the entertainment of the great men of the world, for such never resorted to the church, except to pray and hear the word of God. For the whole care of those teachers was to serve God, not the world, to feed the soul and not the belly. Wilfrid and Acca aren't going to want to have heard that. It's not to say they were necessarily less holy, but they had a very, very different take on how you accomplished your mission. And in the last period, as I say, Bede is writing letters to Egbert. He's saying you should let the people and the priests use their own language for the creed and the paternoster, because even the priests don't know Latin, etc. Now, if he'd have said that in the 14th, 15th century, like Tyndale and Wycliffe, he'd have been persecuted as a heretic. And at one point, he was accused of heresy by followers of Wilfrid, who said at a dinner table one night that Bede was guilty of the heresy of innovation. That was basically because they weren't as well read. They didn't know he was quoting Gregory Nazianzus. But Bede has his revenge. He invents footnotes. He writes the initials of the authors that he's reliant upon in the margins, and he invents the yellow magic marker. He writes little lightning flashes where he's actually quoting. Okay, and he also will actually gloss Hebrew names and give notes for its correct pronunciation and the philological origins. Okay, so he knows some Hebrew as well. And put all of those things together, the social justice elements, he criticised Edgeworth's campaigns against the Scots, the Irish and the British. He said, if only I could build a cell with walls so high that all I could see was the sky, a Tyrrell sky space, I'd still be afraid the love of money and the cares of the world would snatch me away, modelling to people that responsibility comes with power. Women feature a lot. Oh, there's so much one could say, sorry, but changing the face of society is tough. And when we think about Edfrith and others, think about the relations with Iona that continued. Athelstan was instrumental in 697 of getting the first law in the world passed in Ireland for the protection of women, children and non-combatants in history. We could do with their like today, and women as well. Women were often the big negotiators and the diplomatic facilitators within and without the church. Whenever there was a double monastery, it was always an abbess that was in charge, not an abbot, because they were deemed to have better probity. Go figure. I haven't got time to talk to you about all of this, but there you go. I am just going to end by saying that the book that Ceolfrith took with him in 716 as a present to the Pope was one of 3 massive single-volume Bibles that are more a library building than a book. They're authoritative statements about what books you have on the shelves and what editions of those books. And when they came to print the Vulgate in the Counter-Reformation in the 16th century, they found that the most authentic reconstructions, not copies, of the work that Jerome had done in Bethlehem in the 4th century were both from Northumbria. Ceolfrith Bibles and the Lindisfarne Gospels. That's a remarkable intellectual contribution to have undertaken that amount of research and to have the sources. And one trip to Rome, Benedict Biscop took 84 men with him. Imagine the carts that would have trundled back over the Alps and the ships that would have been loaded with images, with books and other resources, and bringing back the lead singer from the papal chapel, because you didn't have pneumatic notation until the 9th century, so it was viva voce teaching of music. It's a remarkable, remarkable thing that they did. It's massive, you couldn't use it. It's a symbolic gesture. And the imagery that I think Bede had a big role in is basically saying, I'm wearing my Italo-Byzantine cloak of invisibility. We are more Roman than the Roman. We are more Syrians than the Syriacs. We are more Byzantine than the Byzantines. And it wasn't until 1880s that it was recognised as English work, because Ceolfrith's name had been erased and the name of a local saint put in its place. The book is serving as an ambassador for the English nation and church to say, yeah, but only here now in these islands at the very limits of the known world where the apostolic age has come to fruition, can that be done. remarkable work. And Bede says at one point, "In this, as in all things of monastic humility, I was both author, notary, and scribe." Authors didn't write their own works normally. It was voice-activated computing in late antiquity and much of the Middle Ages. But Bede thunk it, he wrote it, but he was also a scribe. That means he's a scribe of scripture, like the Sofer in the Jewish Old Testament. A priestly calling, a transformative thing. When the scribe preaches with a pen, unleashes tongues with a finger, every word written is a wound on Satan's body, and as you write those words, you ruminate on them, you chew them over, you meditate on them, and that gives you revelatio, the transformative moment for you and the world. And you fill your inner library with the things needful to know. You can't Google everything. And so Bede, I know, must have been one of the scribes in the 3 Chalfrith Bibles. And in the book, I won't go through the arguments here, they're very technical, but you might want to just have a look sometime. This, I think, is Bede's handwriting. It's a very neat, very Gregorian, looking back to the style of Gregory the Great's Rome around about 600. And here you can see his marginal system, and he's used Greek rather than Latin characters there. Some of the Hebrew things that he uses are there, and the lightning testaments. Coupled with that, it's also Ecclesiastes and Kings that this hand occurs in, which he was working on for his exegesis at that time, and with which he had a very personal relationship. So he's doing those parts. He's also got a supervisory nature. He's correcting other people's texts, and he's doing a lot of the headings and the oversight as well. So I think that is Bede. And his colophon, instead of just saying pray for the scribe, as 4 of the other 7 scribes do, Bede's colophon is labore, the work. And time again, he refers to the work, his vocation. So I think that's Bede. And it's very close to the hand in the Cuthbert Gospels that was placed in Cuthbert's coffin, possibly as early as 698. With an Eastern binding, the earliest Western binding, but it's entirely an Eastern Coptic fashion and technique. Bede's Big World, and that's a Victorian painting showing Bede's last time. He was actually sitting on the stone cold, the cold stone, it said. And he spends the very last days translating John's Gospel, the little Gospel that speaks of the things that work of love that Cuthbert had studied with Boysel, his master at Melrose. And he even refers in his own Life of Cuthbert to the number of gatherings. So the Cuthbert Gospel is made with the number of gatherings that Bede's Life of Cuthbert said the one at Melrose consisted of, that antiquarian referencing of physicality. He spends those last days translating John. He also translates some passages of Isidore that were difficult, that he wanted to despoil any ambiguity about. The ambiguity, I think, additions added after his death to a copy of the Historia Ecclesiastica that was owned either by Alcuin of York or by Charlemagne at the end of the 8th century, referred to a passage of Isidore dealing with consanguinity and the bounds of relationship that were acceptable within marriage. It may well be, I think, perhaps that Chairwolf, we never know the grounds that he was deposed on. Could it have been trumped-up charges of consanguinity? And Bede, again, trying to get in there and protect that, trying to, with Egbert, protect the mixed economy of Celtic and more original Roman hierarchical arrangement of the church in England. But even more importantly, perhaps, he's translating John, the visionary, into his own language to share with his own people. It gets as far as 6:14. That, of course, is the feeding of the 5,000. Bede was hungry to go and be fed himself, and his works have fed an awful lot more than 5,000. Thank you. Sorry, one last thought to think of. That copy I found actually survives. It's in the gloss of the Lindisfarne Gospels, where Reading is used for part of John's Gospel, and we've done the philology, and lo and behold, it's Bedean grammar and other practices there. So we do have the earliest translation of any part of the Bible into any Western vernacular, surviving in a mid-10th century translation of the Lindisfarne Gospels, in which Aldred incorporated Bede's deathbed work, thereby pushing the origins of the Bible in the English language and any Western vernacular back from the mid-10th century to Bede's deathbed in 735.
This was a wonderful talk, and it's just amazing to have this sort of groundbreaking inclusiveness of Bede's thought brought alive to us, and his world brought alive, in the sense that this isn't sort of dusty, challenging pedantry, but it's an amazing mind doing more than anyone else at his time to sort of probe time and space, kind of the cosmic connection with divinity. Thank you.
Oh, it's amazing. And you know, Bede, he loves multivalence. You've got to just never take things at face value. You've got to dig deeper and think about the symbolism. You can't know what an onion is by looking at an onion. You've got to peel an onion. You've got to peel away the layers. You've got to have your eyes water. And then you've got to bite into an onion, and then you've got to learn how to cook with it, how to make medicine and pigments with it.
This is a great exhortation for everyone working on a thesis right now. So we have time for just about sort of 8 minutes of questions. And I think there's some people who will pass microphones to the questioners.
It's all part of my ploy not to get difficult questions.
A question here.
Yeah, can you hear me? Oh, thanks. Yeah, one of the reasons I came here for this lecture was to find out more about a story, a wonderful story that I heard about Bede that I've never forgotten, and I don't think I dreamt it, but I tried to follow it up. I got it from a book in the York Library, and they sold all the books, and now there's just a few computers. And so I looked elsewhere in the university library and couldn't really find anything about it. But it was Theodore of Tarsus, and he was deliberately recruited from the Eastern Church to the Western Church. And the reason for it was that the Cassiodorus library, much of which was in Greek, had been stored at Jarrow and Wearmouth. So it was in the Roman Catholic, as it were, area of Christianity. He was kept in Rome for his hairstyle to grow out. It went into this detail, and then brought to England to be Archbishop of Canterbury. But his job was to make sure that a small boy who was raised within the church, in the Orthodox Western Church, was taught Greek so he could read the Cassiodorus library. That's where he came across Dionysius Exiguus. Yeah. And the reason for all this was, and it was quite urgent, was that the Muslims had started the age that we were living in from the flight to Medina, and were saying that is the beginning of the new world that we have entered. And the Christians were saying, no, it was with the birth of Christ. And they said, well, when was that? But the Christians, who were fundamentalists, had destroyed all the Greek records because they thought Greek was pagan. So this was the only place that they could restore this.
This is fascinating. I want to give Michelle a chance to respond.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Gee, thanks. I think there are some very interesting elements within that. I think the narrative, I don't know who the author is who presented that, but I think it's a combined narrative that somebody with hindsight has created quite cleverly using different aspects. The reason being, Cassiodorus' works weren't in Greek.
No, but he collected Greek.
He collected Greek, but an awful lot of them were
and one of
Latin.
them was Dionysius Exiguus.
The amount of, I think there was a lot of contact between East and West, and you've only got to think about Offa minting coins in Tamworth, medals in Tamworth in 773, copying ones that were minted in Baghdad that same year, to know that there is physical knowledge, etc. But at this early period, yes, people are aware of Islam in the West, but it's still being treated in that early stages by commentators as a Christian heresy. The perspective that you're seeing is one slightly later, post-schismatic. The other thing you have to bear in mind is despite all the rhetoric about Celtic versus Roman at the Synod of Whitby, it's not. Britain and the West is part of the International Orthodox Church.
Right.
Gregory the Great is the poor relation. He's the westernmost of the Eastern patriarchs who writes to his boss in Constantinople saying, why have I been left as the captain at the helm of the leaky ship of the West? I want to be in Sinai using icons and relics and smells, etc. So it's a later worldview projected back. They're very interested about it, but again, it's not yet transparent or clear about the nature of the spread of Islam and its relationship to Christianity. They did know the works of Cassiodorus. There's a lot of debate about which ones they had direct access to, which they only knew reputationally by other works, but one of them at least survives from Weymouth Jarrow in the library at Durham Cathedral, his commentary on the Psalms. So there are interesting things there, but I think really Theodore is sent really to consolidate after the Synod of Whitby. The Celtic side of it isn't the whole of Celtdom, it's the practices of the Columban Church. Many other parts of Ireland were observing different calculations and practices, and many of them were Roman. Palladius was sent from Rome in 431. So it's not as simple as that thing. Yeah. But yes, he would have known about that. Cassiodorus and Agapetus were going to establish a massive mop-up operation to produce a big library in Rome. They've even decided how they were going to decorate the mosaics in the hall, but it came to nothing. But it was resurrected by Benedict and Ceolfrith subsequently and done.
I want to see if we can get one or two more questions.
Thank you very much.
Yes, that was a biggie, sorry.
Yeah.
Hi, I was thinking about the translation into English. Of course, he'd have had a different kind of language in 7th or 8th century England. Would he even have written or spoken in a Geordie dialect?
Well, Old English. Certainly the Northumbrian dialect is different from the West Saxon dialect as it emerges increasingly from the late 9th century onwards. But even there, I've argued that the Northumbria's got an interesting role in that. When Alfred is busy burning cakes in the Athens marches, what suddenly happens, he has visions of St. Cuthbert. What's happened in the north? Well, the refugees from Holy Island haven't got out of the kitchen because of the Vikings and gone walkabout as refugees for 40 years. That is them paralleling Moses and the Israelites in the wilderness, etc. They go south to Crake. They never abandon Holy Island. They stage a diplomatic coup, overthrow the Viking ruler of York, and put a convert Dane onto the throne in his place. And that's the point at which Alfred has visions of Cuthbert, because the community of Cuthbert have facilitated relationships between Alfred and the north to perpetuate a Christian presence in the north and to facilitate the conquest and integration.
We have just reached the time now, but Michelle will be signing. Or one more? Is it a short one?
Go on, short one.
It's got to be short.
Yeah, I'm going to be signing outside for half an hour if anybody wants. And if you don't want to buy a book, I'll sign the back of your hand. But you can't ever wash again.
Very niche question, for which I apologise, but and excuse my ignorance on the subject. But I just wondered why you associated the Synod of Hatfield in 681 with the southern Hatfield and not with the Hatfield in Doncaster, which was actually part of the Kingdom of Lindsey.
Yeah, there has been a bit of discourse about that. I haven't taken part in that argument, but the weight now of scholarly opinion is it's the Hatfield that's just to the north of London. But yeah, I can see why you would ask that. So it's the tryout in 679, which is the international pre-summit for the 681 in Constantinople.
This was a wonderful talk. Thank you. Michelle will be outside signing her book or signing your hand. And Fox Lane Books has many other books as well. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Can we all thank Michelle?